Magdeburg Confession. I finally finished reading it. I'll pass it around today if you want to read this. 1550. By all accounts, the siege of Magdeburg, which was a city a little bit southwest of Berlin there near Wittenberg, this is an interesting account, and this isn't really highlighted all that much. Luther died in 1546. Everything kind of went to pot after that. The Augsburg Interim was in 1548, where Charles V said, well, you Lutherans can kind of do your things, but you got to do some Roman Catholic things too. And it was a compromise, essentially. And in the city of Magdeburg, these 9 pastors hunkered down, and the siege lasted for a year. And I forget how many were killed. So it's 4,000 of Charles' forces were killed. 468 Magdeburgers lost their lives. And the siege ended in 1551. It's a very fascinating account. A lot of Lutherans are not aware of this. And then everything kind of settled in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. And that was the famous line, cuus regio, eius religio. In other words, your region, your religion. Whoever the prince was, the duke, if he was evangelical. Now, when you read this book, morning, Tim, when you go through this, it's very interesting because the term Lutheran is never used. Do you know that Lutherans never used, you've heard me say this before, right? Evangelicals. They mention evangelicals in here. That's you, that's me. We're evangelicals. Yeah. And it's very fascinating. But anyway, read this confession. The reason I got this book, and a lot of pastors recommended it, was the issues of resistance. And that's what I'm particularly interested in on the 3 arguments for resistance to the lesser magistrates, what they refer to as the lesser magistrates. In other words, the imposition of the lesser magistrates of religious matters, doctrinal matters on the church. How do we deal with that? And I think we're in an era right now where we are dealing with resistance to the lesser magistrates. And that's why I particularly wanted to read this, because there's several chapters here concerning resistance. And what I would like to do, and this is an area I failed in miserably, I know this, concerning resistance to the tyrannical governments that we have. Governments, plural, because we have different layers. But I believe we need to look at this biblically and learn from history of how Christians have engaged in resistance to tyrants. Pastor Roberts.
Well, have you read the latest from Gavin, the governor?
No.
He gives the rules for Thanksgiving. First, you can't meet in your house. That's first. You got to eat outside. It's just unbelievable that anybody can put it. There's about 10 or 12 of these horrible requirements for Thanksgiving.
I think the governor's in over his head.
He's gone bonkers.
I think he should stick to wine making, perhaps. Anyway, I commend this to your reading. If you'd like to get it, it's an easy read. It's a little bit difficult to read sometimes because they get a little bit redundant and go over the same things, and they use some terms that I had to look up to that I'm not quite familiar with. They'll talk about the audiophorus, the interimists, and things of this nature too. But they have a wonderful confession of faith in here of the evangelical doctrine, and in 1550 how they wanted to confess that. Here's the bottom line. Many believe the Reformation would not have succeeded were it not for these 9 pastors.
Wow.
Well, if you think about this, if they didn't put up any resistance, then the whole, the Roman Catholic, the interim would have been imposed on the Lutherans, and it would have been a big compromise, right? And you know what happens in churches when there's compromises? You can see this. So it's very interesting, and I think it's significant. See, Luther was already dead for 4 years, so they didn't have the man to rally around. And I think we forget, we can puff out our chests on Reformation Sunday, but the Reformation almost died. Until you get to 1550, and they stood up for this, and as a result, Charles V, 5 years later, imposed the Peace of Augsburg, which essentially allowed the Lutherans to continue in their doctrines and practices. So my question is today, what level of resistance does the church offer towards tyrannical government when they impose doctrinal or practical matters on us, as you had mentioned? And they're certainly there. We know them. They're in the guidelines. And our congregation is offering a certain level of resistance to some of those guidelines, right? How many are we violating of the codes in there? Well, some of them are pretty apparent, okay? But others were not. So there's this whole level of compliance and resistance. Very fascinating to me. So, God, the interesting thing, too, on the show today and tomorrow on the radio was this intersection of God and civil governments. And how much of an interest does God take in all of this? And how does he intervene? And how does his sovereignty work? And to me, that's a very fascinating one as well. So anyway, I'll pass this around if you'd like to look at it. And you can certainly order it if you'd like. Get it on Kindle, or you can get a paper copy too. Anybody have any questions about that? The Magdeburg Confession. That was never translated into English until about 8 or 9 years ago, which is why we didn't learn it in seminary. All right.